Thank you for joining me again, team. In this screencast, we're going to cover sections 12.3 and 12.4. In section 12.3, we're going to talk about the environmental problems that arise from food production. Food production is necessary for our health and survival, but agriculture also has significant harmful effects on the environment. Agriculture impacts biodiversity, soil, water, air, and human health. In addition to this, agriculture uses about 20% of energy use and 40% of water use in the United States. This infographic from the textbook gives several examples of different impacts that agriculture has in different areas of the environment. The loss of topsoil is a serious problem caused by agriculture around the world. Let's start by talking about what soil is. Soil is formed when parent material, usually rock, is weathered, which means broken down, transported, and deposited. Soil is made up of three different types of particles: sand, which is the largest, silt, and clay, which is the smallest. Soil can be categorized into different soil types, and the type of soil can be determined by using a soil triangle shown here on the right. This diagram shows how soil develops, starting with rock, which we call the parent material, which breaks down over time to form the different layers of soil. Please be familiar with the different layers of soil. The top layer is the O layer. It's also called humus, or the organic layer. The second layer is the A layer and is topsoil. The third layer is the E layer, or the eluviated horizon. This is a layer where water passes through and leaches and lightens the soil there. The next layer is the B layer, or the subsoil. Then you have the C layer, which is the parent material. Then you have the R layer, which is bedrock. Soil erosion is defined as the movement of soil from one place to another by wind or water. This results in a loss in fertility in the area where the soil is lost and sediment pollution in the bodies of water where the soil is deposited. This map shows where soil erosion is of serious concern in red and some concern in blue. You can see it covers much of the world. Another problem that affects agricultural land is desertification. Desertification occurs when the fertility of the land or the productive potential of the topsoil falls by 10% or more. Desertification is caused by prolonged drought or intensive agriculture. One example of desertification occurring is the Dust Bowl in the Midwestern United States in the 1930s, where drought caused severe wind erosion of topsoil. The way that we water our crops, called irrigation, has environmental impacts as well. About 70% of human freshwater use is for irrigation. Overwatering crops can cause a condition called soil salinization, where salts build up or accumulate in the soil. This is usually caused because water will evaporate, leaving any dissolved salt behind, and this can lower crop yields and even kill plants. Another problem caused by irrigation is waterlogging. Waterlogging occurs when overwatering raises the water table and prevents roots from getting oxygen. Plant roots need aeration in order to grow properly. Agriculture also contributes to air pollution and climate change. When forests are cleared and burned for croplands, it produces air pollutants and carbon dioxide. About 1/4 of human-generated greenhouse gases can be attributed to agriculture. About 18% of human-generated greenhouse gases can be attributed solely to livestock, especially the methane produced when cows digest their food and belch. Agriculture threatens biodiversity because when we clear grasslands and forests and replace them with croplands, we destroy or fragment habitat for wild species. Because monoculture is replacing polyculture worldwide, about 95% of the vegetable varieties we had in 1903 are now extinct. Today, we are trying to establish seed banks to preserve some of this agrobiodiversity. In modern times, scientists have manipulated the DNA of food to make it grow faster, last longer, or be more nutritious. This is called genetic engineering, and genetically engineered foods have both pros and cons. Some people think that genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, will help us solve world food problems. But a lot of other people worry that these GMOs will create hybrids with natural organisms and cause problems that way. This infographic shows both the pros and cons of genetically modified crops and food. Let's talk about the pros and cons of industrialized meat production. Industrialized meat production allows us to produce a lot of meat. It also reduces overgrazing when we use feedlots and CAFOs. And finally, as meat supply goes up, meat prices go down, which keep the price of food cheap. The cons of industrialized meat production include the large amounts of water required to raise the animals and the food they eat, and the environmental cost associated with meat production, which include the clearing of land for ranching, the methane produced by cows, and the water pollution caused by animal waste. In the infographic, you can see how much water goes into meat production. For example, 1 pound of beef requires almost 2,000 gallons of water. This diagram shows the significant difference in the amount of water required to produce meat versus producing produce. This diagram shows that 36% of global crop production goes into raising animals and points out that eating meat may not be the best way to feed as many people in the world as possible. This infographic shows the pros and cons of using animal feedlots to produce meat. Aquaculture can cause several environmental problems and affect aquatic ecosystems around it. First, wild fish are often caught to feed farm fish, which ruins the point of farming fish for food. Secondly, species raised in aquaculture can escape and become invasive species in neighboring areas. And finally, fish farms concentrate large numbers of fish in small areas, producing a lot of waste that can pollute the environment around it. This infographic shows the pros and cons of aquaculture. In section 12.4, we're going to talk about how we can protect crops from pests more sustainably. Any species that interferes with human welfare is called a pest, and nature tends to control the populations of most pests. When pest populations get too high, natural enemies come in to reduce their numbers. On farms, pesticides are used to control pest populations. Pesticides are chemicals used to kill or control populations of pests. Biopesticides are naturally produced by plants to ward off insects and herbivores. The pesticides used in agriculture came in two waves. First generation pesticides were derived or borrowed from plants. Second generation pesticides were produced in labs. An example was DDT, which we'll talk about later. Pesticides can be broad spectrum or narrow spectrum agents. Broad spectrum agents will kill or control many different pests. Narrow spectrum agents will only kill one or a few pests. Finally, persistence in the environment will vary for different pesticides. That means different pesticides last for different amounts of time in nature before breaking down. Synthetic pesticides get a lot of criticism, but they do have benefits. Synthetic pesticides can save human lives. For example, DDT was sprayed to kill mosquitoes and prevent the spread of malaria. Pesticides can also increase food yields, food supplies, and profits for farmers. And finally, pesticides have to be tested and approved, and as a result, the health risks they pose tend to be very low compared to the benefits they provide. We also have to talk about the drawbacks of using synthetic pesticides. Pesticide use can accelerate the rate of genetic resistance in pests, causing them to become more tolerant to the pesticide and requiring farmers to use either more pesticide or different pesticides for the pests. Pesticides can also be very expensive. Pesticides can also kill unintended organisms, including wildlife around the farm. Pesticides cause pollution in the environment and also do pose some risk to human health. This infographic summarizes the pros and cons of using synthetic chemical pesticides. This infographic gives you a list of things that you can do to minimize your exposure to pesticides. As I mentioned before, DDT was a pesticide used in the mid-1900s to kill mosquitoes and prevent the spread of malaria. Unfortunately, DDT had side effects in the environment. First, it caused the thinning of birds' eggshells through biomagnification. DDT traveled through the food chain and concentrated in birds. And when mother birds laid their eggs, they would crush the egg and kill the developing chick as a result. Secondly, DDT also caused the deaths of other insects, lizards, and even cats. When we look at the data in the United States, we see that pesticide use has not led to a reduction in crop loss due to pests. Between 1942 and 1997, crop losses from insects went from 7% to 13%, even though we were using 10 times more pesticides. Organizations, laws, and treaties can help protect us from the harmful effects of pesticides. In the United States, we have the EPA, or Environmental Protection Agency, USDA, or United States Department of Agriculture, and the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration. We also have the Fungicide and Rodenticide Act of 1947 and the Food Quality Protection Act of 1996. Unfortunately, even though we're protected here in the United States, American companies can still export banned pesticides to other places. Pesticides can also be transmitted in the atmosphere, making their way back to the United States. We don't have to use synthetic pesticides. There are many alternatives. First, we can use crop rotation, where you plant different crops at different times during the year, never allowing one pest to take full control. You can also use polyculture, which creates habitat for enemies of the pest. You can implant genetic resistance to a pest by using genetic engineering. You can also just bring in the natural enemy to take care of your pest. You can also use insect perfumes called pheromones to attract insects and trap them. You can use hormones to interfere with pest life cycles and prevent reproduction. And finally, you can use alternative methods of weed control, such as crop rotation, cover crops, and mulches. Mulch is shown here in the photograph in the form of wood chips placed around the trees. Integrated pest management, or IPM, is a more sustainable approach to pest management because it includes a combination of both biological and chemical techniques to prevent pests and the damage they cause. Because it doesn't depend only on pesticides, it allows us to decrease pollution and pesticide costs. It does have its disadvantages. It requires expert knowledge and has higher initial costs.